Hello, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of our read-through of the Libertines. So if you weren't with us the last couple of days, I do recommend going back and listening to them because there's a lot of plot happening. But basically, where we left off at the end of the last session was that our hero Alexo has gone off with a young ruffian called Gaspardo, who he believes to be the wealthy son of the Jewish man who gave him a job after he escaped from the convent/monastery. None of these identities are real, so it's quite difficult relaying it because there's layers of deception going on, and I'm trying to remember where we are in those layers of deception. The other part of the story was that Father Francis turned out to be a baddie. He'd seduced a young woman called Catherine. It ended up causing her death. And he ends up at the end of that chapter using poison to take his own life, unfortunately. So Jerome is still standing at this point and sort of crowing in victory over his inveterate enemy, Father Francis. So without more ado, let's get into the story. And I'm sure that we'll have plenty of adventures today. Chapter 4. The epigraph is from Akenside. But not alike to every mortal eye is this great scene unveiled, for since the claims of social life to different labours urge the active powers of man, with wise intent the hand of nature on peculiar minds imprints a different bias, and to each decrees its province in the common toil. Alexo and his pupil had not travelled far before Gaspardo sunk into a gloomy state of reflection. Alexo endeavoured to divert his mind from meditation, but to no purpose. His raillery and pleasant jokes were lost. At last he spoke. "Alexo," said he, "I esteem you as a friend, and would willingly obey the directions of the Jew, but my feelings are too powerful for the base ties of false honour. I claim no kindred with that fellow. He is not my father, nor one of the Hebrew tribe, but a man of the most despicable character. He traffics with robbers and murderers, and encourages them to commit the most inhuman crimes for the sole purpose of enriching himself by sharing the spoil. You know him well, Alexo. He is no other person than Father Jerome, a monk of St. Dominic's order. Now hear what a villain he is. You recollect the man who styled himself Pedro?" "Yes," answered Alexo, I do." "Then," replied Gaspardo, "you have seen one of the most hardened and bloody knaves in all Spain. His intimacy with you is the effect of design, for as soon as you quitted the convent, Jerome employed that fellow to entrap you, and that house was to have been the place of murder, and myself the perpetrator. Pedro hired me himself, through the means of a man who resides in the province of Old Castile. But I thought well of you, and persuaded Jerome to let me take you from the house and dispatch you in a forest at no great distance. This contrivance was only to reveal the plot to you, and save your life." During this extraordinary speech, Alexo continued in a state of dreadful surprise, and turning to Gaspardo, thanked him on his knees for the preservation of his life. "I hope one day," said he, "to be revenged upon my enemy." "Revenge!" cried Gaspardo, flourishing a pistol in the air, and his eyes sparkling with delight. "Bravo! The sooner it is satisfied, the better appetite for the deed. Let it be tonight. Tonight let us return to Madrid and shoot the old beldam through the head. We shall then have no impediment in our way. There's plenty of ill-gotten wealth, I warrant, and to reward us for our trouble." Alexo hesitated and made some objection to undertake so violent a proceeding. "It may endanger our lives," he replied. "No, not in the least," said Gaspardo. "I know the house is inhabited by the old woman only, and its retired situation precludes us from the possibility of an attack from passengers." He stopped and looked steadfastly at Alexo and exclaimed, "Why do you hesitate? If a share in the abundant riches we shall find in the house will not tempt you, the alternative is this," putting one of his pistols to his head, "for I am resolved upon the deed." "Hold," cried Alexo, "I consent." They turned back and loitered about the metropolis until the approach of midnight, when they went by a private way to the house of the pretended Jew. They rapped at the door, and for some time no one appeared. At last the old woman opened the little grate and inquired who was there and what they wanted. "We are returned," said Alexo, "in consequence of an accident that has happened to the Jew's son. A fall from the mule renders him incapable of sitting on the animal, and unless medical assistance is procured, his death will be the certain consequence." "Oh, lack a day!" she cried. "What is to be done? But here is no one but myself in the house, and I am old and lame." "Open the door," said Alexo, "and let us in, for the night air is very cold." The bolts gradually drew back, and immediately the door opened. Gaspardo rushed forward and grabbed and stabbed the old duenna to the heart. Without making any noise, and by the moonlight that beamed through the lattice into the passage, they raised the body from the ground and, conveying it into the garden, buried it in the most unfrequented part of the thick shrubbery. It's all gone quite wrong quite quickly, hasn't it? Gaspardo then hurried to the house and led Alexo through a long gallery to the room where he had seen the monk weighing the silver and bartering with the thieves. They forced open a small door in the wall where Gaspardo said a valuable chest was deposited, and as they were busily employed in searching for the booty, the tone of a lute was faintly heard, accompanied by a female voice. "What is that?" cried Gaspardo as he started from the spot. Alexo replied that he had once heard the sound of music, accompanied, as he supposed, by the same voice, and about the same hour of the night. After a pause of some minutes, the air was repeated. By following the sound of the lute, they discovered the room in which the unfortunate sorrower was confined, and after much trouble succeeded in forcing open the door. When they entered the apartment, a lady of an elegant figure, apparently worn out with distress, rose from a couch and addressed them. "I have long anticipated your business, and I am ready. Death is the only refuge from the piercing calamities I now labour under, and I meet it as the minister of future happiness." She drew a picture from her bosom and kissed it with affectionate transports. At this instant a clock in some neighbouring church struck one. "We are your friends," cried Gaspardo, but it was past midnight. We must travel many miles before daybreak. If you will follow us, we will conduct you to a place of safety." "Gracious God!" she exclaimed. "Am I to look upon you as my deliverers from captivity?" "Waste no time," said Gaspardo, in exclamations of gratitude. "Our business is with the concealed treasures of your jailer. Take the lamp and follow us." They stationed the lady at the top of the stairs while they descended into a vault, the floor of which was strewed with the mouldering bones and skulls of human beings, to warn them if anyone entered the house during their search. For the many private ways that communicated with the prison of the Inquisition fully justified the prudence of such a step. "Perchance," said Alexo, as he passed over the scattered ashes of the dead, "this is the unfortunate Cleanthe's tomb." "Come along," cried Gaspardo as he trimmed a torch which he carried by thrusting it against the damp and rugged walls of the cavern. "Come along, our time is short. We must not idle it away in reflection." They went to work and soon discovered a large chest filled with valuables which they plundered. "Another such as this, and I should set off contented," cried Gaspardo. "But we cannot stay any longer. The monks of St. Dominic will be stirring, and my professional brethren quitting their stations on the forest roads for their haunts in the city." He had scarce finished his speech when Alexo perceived the lady hastily descending the stairs. "We are betrayed," she cried. "How?" exclaimed Gaspardo. "Betrayed?" By this time the lady had got within hearing. "You are discovered," she uttered, with a countenance expressive of horror. "There is a fellow in the house calling aloud for the old housekeeper. I saw him pass through the gallery as I stood in the passage." Gaspardo, without saying a word, extinguished the lights and precipitately left the cavern. After some time had elapsed, Alexo saw him descending the stairs, accompanied by a man whom he knew from his voice and stature to be the villain Pedro. "Merciful God!" he exclaimed. "They are coming to murder us." The lady grasped him by the hand. "Let us secrete ourselves," she cried, "in one of the recesses that surround this horrid dungeon. Perchance we may discover some outlet that will enable us to escape their designs." At that moment, the light suddenly disappeared, and they were again left in total darkness. "Now," said Alexo, "let us fly from this scene of blood. The time is precious." They hastened along the gloomy vault and had nearly gained the stairs when Gaspardo appeared with a lamp at the extremity of the cavern. Hist, hist, he cried as he approached. All is safe, all is safe. Where are you going? Surely you would not leave me alone in this horrible place. What? You thought, I suppose, that Pedro was coming to pay you a visit. He is a sad dog, but I've sent him away very well satisfied. Still, that is no reason but that he may return with assistance and secure us, for I have had several examples of his treachery. Follow me, and let us be gone while we are at liberty. After traversing a long narrow passage, they ascended a winding staircase which led into a small romantic tower that was situated in a secluded part of the garden. So far, so good, said Gaspardo as he threw the lamp upon the ground. We have now only to mount our mules and gain the high road to Castile to be out of the power of Pedro and his hoary confederates in iniquity. Come, my lady, give me leave to assist you to seat yourself behind Alexo. I'm not accustomed to gallant the sex, but I suspect myself to be possessed of the feelings of a man, and his first duty is that of attention to the female part of society. I have a wench at home that will prove good company, I warrant, or she is not what I take her for. He then assisted the lady to seat herself on the mule behind Alexo, and mounting his own left the metropolis by a private and unfrequented road, as he said, for his cottage in Old Castile. They rode furiously along until the morning broke over the blue summits of the mountains before them, when the songs of muleteers and the tinkling of bells were heard upon the distant plains. "'Tis now time to alter our course," cried Gaspardo as he struck into a small winding pathway of a thick wood by the roadside, through which they continued their journey until late in the day, when they arrived at a hut situated in a solitary valley at the foot of a barren and stupendous mountain. The only person that appeared to inhabit this lonely dwelling was an arch boy, expert at anything but honesty. He took good care of the mules and supplied the travellers with excellent refreshment. As the evening approached, they left the hovel and continued their route until the third day, passing along the most unfrequented and intricate paths and stopping frequently at small huts in their road for food. Then they discovered a cottage surrounded by a clump of tall trees in a retired part of a forest. Gaspardo alighted from his mule and rapped at the door. It was immediately opened by a young woman who saluted him with, "You're welcome home, my love. If you knew how I have been plagued to know where you—" Gaspardo knitted his brows and laying his pistols upon the table. "Rose," said he rather pettishly, "these are two friends of mine. They've travelled a long journey without murmuring, and you must make them merry and welcome with our homely fare. I'm a gentleman by birth, my lady, but reduced by necessity to fell wood in this forest for the support of myself and my family. I cannot treat you with dainties, but the best my storehouse affords shall be set before you." He immediately procured, with the assistance of Rose, some refreshment, consisting of bread, cheese, fruit, and excellent wine. When the sun was set, Gaspardo suddenly disappeared and left the travellers with his wife. Alexo endeavoured by artful interrogation to gain some information respecting Gaspardo and the employment he followed in so solitary a residence, but to no purpose. She was extremely reserved, and her answers to all his questions, although ambiguous, were guarded with expressions that fully supported the honesty of her husband. To rid herself of the conversation, she expressed a wish to know how Gaspardo came acquainted with them, and who they were, and this circumstance drew from the lady the following narrative. The history of Donna Clorinda. I am the descendant of a noble family in Madrid, and was married at an early age to Don Alfonso de Berinda, whose family, disapproving of our union, condemned us to live in obscurity upon a scanty income in a small house near the metropolis. We continued in this situation for some years, during which period I was mother to a son and daughter. We brought them both up in the faith of the most holy Catholic religion. I carefully instructed my daughter in the most useful branches of female education, and the boy, under the tuition of his father, excelled in all the manly exercises he taught him. He instilled into his mind the love of hardship and the desire of acquiring fame and respect by courage and honourable actions. In the meridian of our happiness, the Minister of State received information that a conspiracy was forming against the government. He employed the most despicable artifices to involve every person in trouble that he disliked. Informers, under the mark of friendship, entered the families of the innocent, and bribing their servants with large sums, caused them, upon the evidence of such sorry scoundrels, to be apprehended and committed to the care of jailers and other imperious officers of the crown. It was the fate of Don Alfonso to be suspected from his singular mode of living. He was warned of the consequences that must inevitably result from his continuing near the metropolis, and advised to leave the country. He hesitated, but the horrid idea of the Inquisition surmounted all sensibility,
and hearing that his house was beset by the officers of injustice, he consulted his safety by a precipitate retreat in the middle of the night. My sensations at this melancholy event can better be conceived than described. He was accompanied only by his son, who affectionately insisted to share his father's misfortunes. To me, he denied that felicity, expressing his hopes that the reign of a Spanish Nero would not be long, and then he could return to me in safety. Some time elapsed before I heard from him, and then his letter did not discover the place of his retreat. But this solitary pleasure was soon denied me, for the state, proceeding upon the most dishonourable and unprincipled plan, privately opened the letters that appeared suspicious, and condemned what they found, as if coming from conspirators, to the flames. A proclamation was also issued, describing the persons of the fugitives with a large reward for their apprehension, dead or alive, and denouncing a confiscation of their property. Our little all was accordingly embezzled by these state councillors. At this afflicting period, a friar of the Order of St. Dominic interfered and caused part of our property to be restored. Our gratitude on this occasion was beyond bounds. We loaded him with blessings and thankful acknowledgments for his disinterested generosity. His frequent visits to our melancholy retirement were received with those expressions of approbation and friendship which our obligations to him required. And thinking myself highly honoured by his acquaintance, I readily granted him his request of becoming my confessor. My spirits were continually depressed, and although my daughter strove by tears and entreaties to dissuade me from despondency, I gave myself up, a prey to grief and despair. Father Jerome, for that was his name, conjured me to reflect upon the distressing situation I should place my daughter in if I continued to add to my afflictions by indulging in melancholy. "You will be left," said he, "without a friend in a dissolute and abandoned world." His words roused me to a sense of my maternal duty, and the gloom that hung upon my mind was dispelled by his advice, and no other thought but a strict attention to my daughter's welfare and happiness occupied my mind. The beauty of my daughter greatly attracted the notice of the young cavaliers of Madrid, who designedly met us in our walks, and fearful some unpleasant intrigue might be the result of their civilities to her, I determined to leave the metropolis and retire into a distant solitude, for her heart was engaged to Bertram, a cavalier of distinction, deservedly esteemed, and who was on a journey in Andalusia. Having communicated my intention to the friar, he highly commended so prudent a step, advised me by all means not to prolong my stay in the city on any account. "It is a place," said he, "where vice and debauchery are the prevailing habits of the inhabitants, where the villainies of mankind are practised without fear or shame, and where youth and beauty remain insecure from violence, though under the immediate protection of age and experience. The attention paid to Cleanthe by our young cavaliers has the effect of a dissolute and lawless passion, and her personal charms only draw forth their flattering admiration. And exposing her to injuries arising from constant adulation, you commit an act of immorality. Besides, if Bertram loves her, you hold in trust an inestimable treasure, far greater to him than the dominion of empires. I feel a regard for you, and of course become interested in your daughter's welfare. As I have devoted my time and influence to the happiness of both, I shall continue to assist you in your solitude. Let me hear from you soon." So he spake. He took my hand, and pressing it affectionately to his lips, retired, apparently in sorrow. I felt an unusual degree of regret in parting with a character so deservedly esteemed, for I looked upon him as the protector of distressed innocence and the friend of the unfortunate. I retired to rest and continued musing upon my pillow until about the hour of midnight, when I was suddenly roused from reflection by the repeated and violent shrieks of a person in distress. I rose instantly, and rushing into my daughter's bedchamber, found her almost lifeless in the arms of a female servant. I inquired the cause, but could gain no answer. At length I heard a violent and loud rap at the door, and on looking out of the window discovered a party of men muffled in their cloaks waiting near the portico. I demanded their business, and they replied that their commission did not extend so far as to answer that question, and bade me open the door. I withdrew from the window to the bedside where my daughter sat, but I had scarce been there a minute when the door was burst open, and 3 ruffians soon appeared and entered the apartment. They instantly seized me and my daughter, and hurrying us into a coach that was waiting at the door, drove off to the prison of the Inquisition. When we arrived in the courtyard, I begged to take a farewell of my daughter, whom they were hurrying away. This request was sternly denied, and forcing me along a narrow passage, they confined me in a loathsome dungeon. My grief at this unprincipled act of barbarity was unbounded. I tore my hair and beat my bosom in the anguish of horror and despair. I called upon the good and benevolent Father of St. Dominic for assistance, but in vain. The dreadful stillness of the place seemed only interrupted by my disconsolate and afflicting cries. I continued for some weeks in my prison without seeing any human being but the speechless ruffian that brought me food. One night, as I was consoling myself with a book of prayers that lay in my cell, a man in the habit of a friar came into my dungeon and said he had terms to propose to me upon which my liberty depended. I desired him to explain himself. He then replied, I am desired by the Holy Office to release you, provided you promise never to mention the circumstance of your imprisonment, nor demand your daughter, but to forget her. By this unfeeling and barbarous proposition, I was almost harrowed up to a pitch of madness, and swore by the powers of heaven never to sacrifice an innocent and friendless child for liberty, although my sufferings were increased with tenfold severity. Then you are determined, said he, to languish in this horrid dungeon at the expense of a little mistaken sensibility. Your daughter will live in Eastern magnificence, the mistress of a great man. Is a situation not to be rejected. Sorry, there's a mark on the page. Away, I cried, for I will never yield to such abominable persuasions. I had rather expire upon the rack than live the base betrayer of my daughter's honour. I fell upon my knees and prayed that she might drench her hands in the blood of him who dared by such hellish means to insult his God and damn the character of his sex. The villain immediately struck me a blow on the face and retired, muttering these words as he closed the door. You will see her no more. In the gloom of solitude and harassed by reflection and sorrow, my fancy pictured the beautiful Cleanthe in the hands of murderers. Her piercing entreaties sounded in my ears, mingled with the horrid and blasphemous imprecations of those sanguinary ruffians. I thought I saw her bloodied corpse lie lifeless on the ground, and kneeled to kiss it, but when reason returned, and I found them but the dreams of a disturbed imagination, I threw myself in horror on the couch, and in floods of tears passed away the hours of the night. In this dreadful situation I spent some months. My food was bad, and rendered feeble by the noxious vapours of the dungeon, my strength was not sufficient to withstand the consequences of a cold, and it gradually increased until I was reduced to the necessity of keeping my bed. I was then daily attended by a woman who administered the medicines prescribed for my relief by the physician of the prison, and who constantly persuaded me to accept the terms offered by the friar for my liberty. Her endeavours were ineffectual. She excited my pity, though, for I justly concluded her conduct was an act of imperious necessity. After a few days' nursing, I was sufficiently recovered to quit my bed and walk about my cell, and one night, as I was rising for exercise from my solitary couch, the door of my cell turned slowly upon its hinges, and a form, to all appearances the phantom of a female, bearing a small lamp in her right hand and a bloody cross in the left, stood before me. I shrieked aloud, and I attempted to move, but on a sudden I seemed fixed to the spot, and the power of utterance suspended. It pointed to some bloody marks upon its bosom, and with a slow and hollow voice spoke as follows. Behold the spirit of your murdered daughter. Her body moulders among the unhallowed dead in the secret caverns of this dreadful prison. To you her death may be ascribed, and to punish the obstinacy of a heart that might have saved, by yielding to mistaken prejudices, the life of an unfortunate child, I am doomed to visit you at the silent hour of midnight, when all eyes but thine are sealed in slumber. It glared at me for some time with a terrific frown, when it looked up piteously as to heaven and left the apartment. Instantly I fell senseless on the floor. How long I laid in this situation I cannot tell, but when I had in some measure recovered my senses, I found myself in total darkness. For the light which was placed near me on a projection of the rugged wall of my prison, I had in my convulsive struggles thrown down and extinguished. I passed the remainder of the night in prayer, and when the morning dawned, I became so sensible of my situation that I had nearly insulted my God by committing an act of suicide. Some time after the first appearance of the ghost, it stood before me again about the hour of midnight, and pointing to the wound, vanished as before. The next month, I was taken from my dungeon, first having a handkerchief tied over my eyes, and conveyed away in a coach. After I had left the coach about half an hour, it was removed, and I found myself in a cell in the convent of St. Dominic, and Jerome sitting by my side. You may easily conceive my joy and surprise at finding myself in the company of my faithful friend. I fell upon his neck in an agony of sorrow, and after a pause of some minutes I told him of the villainous proceedings of some unknown inquisitor and the appearance of the spectre. His sympathy for my unhappy situation almost bordered upon madness. He wrung his hands and appeared to feel for my misfortunes in a manner that convinced me of his sincerity and disinterested regard for me. As we were conversing together, a voice uttered in a solemn manner, Beware of the perfidious and designing sex. I started from my seat, but he caught me by my clothes and pulled me again toward him. We remained in doubtful suspense for some time, but a prevailing silence convincing us we were alone, the conversation was resumed. It chiefly turned upon my daughter's cruel death, and the means I intended taking to reveal it to the world. I perceived him extremely agitated at this proposition, and he left the cell as in deep thought. From that time I saw him no more. In the evening a monk brought me a flask of wine and some provisions, and begged that I would try to refresh myself by repose. The wine somewhat relieved my sinking spirits, and I lay down upon a mattress in the cell. Sleep overtook me, but about midnight I was awakened by a loud rap at the door. I rose from the couch and opened it. A man in a mask immediately entered the cell and led me from the monastery to a coach that was waiting at a small door leading into a dark, narrow street. It drove off with us in it, to the house where you discovered me. On my entering it, an old crooked woman bade me dry up my tears, for I should soon be happy. She led me to the room where you found me. I frequently urged her to tell me the cause of my imprisonment, but she never made me any answer. One day she brought a lamp and an old lute, which she said would afford me amusement when I was inclined to use it. It was an inestimable treasure. I constantly soothed my mind with the most plaintive airs I was master of, and cheered my gloomy apartment with the song of melancholy. I am indebted to you for my delivery, and the preservation of my life. I must leave it to your own feelings to determine how sensibly I revere your unlooked-for generosity and humanity. At the conclusion of this narrative, Alexo returned to the lady and replied, Alas, madam, the truth of your daughter's inhuman murder I can confirm. I once had the misfortune to be thrown into the prison of the Inquisition, and was put into the same dungeon where the unfortunate Cleanthe was confined. Alexo then related to her the discovery of the manuscript, with the unburied bones of a child. He also undeceived her respecting the character of Jerome, and told her of his adventure with him and Decaris in the chapel of the convent of St. Dominic. Villain! Exclaimed Donna Clorinda. Was it for this that I innocently and virtuously admitted you into the sanctuary of my family, and cherished in my heart the feeds of gratitude? Oh God, how long is this execrable monster to triumph in his crimes, to insult thee by profaning the holy altar, to mock the laws of religion, and in contempt of thy sacred commands riot in licentious depravity? Sorrow overcame her, and agitated by the convulsive struggles of horror and affection, she sunk into a swoon. Rose instantly flew for some water, and whilst they were busied in endeavouring to recover her, the dog barked loud, and footsteps of some person approaching the door were instantly heard. It was Gaspardo. As he entered the house, he started in seeming surprise, and inquired the reason of Rose why they were not at rest. The hour is late, he cried. Perhaps you are not aware that it is past midnight. She pleaded Clorinda's indisposition in excuse for her conduct, and after lighting a lamp for him, returned to her assistance. When Clorinda was so far recovered as to be able to walk, Rose conducted her to a chamber, and desiring to be called if she should in the night feel herself at all indisposed, left her to assuage the anguish of her heart in silent sorrow. Whilst Alexo sat in the room below, by the embers of a wood fire, listening to the sighing of the night winds among the trees that surrounded the cottage, Gaspardo came downstairs with a brace of pistols in his girdle, and a large sabre under his arm. He looked suspiciously at Alexo and asked him if he did not intend to go to rest that night. On Alexo's replying in the affirmative, and that he only waited for a lamp, he turned his appearance off with a smile and said, You see, sir, I carry with me forcible arguments in favour of my profession. You understand me, I have no doubt. But be secret, for your life depends upon it. Early in the morning I shall call you to work with me in the forest as a woodcutter to avoid suspicion. Rose will take care of the lady. You will be acquainted with more of us in time. Farewell. Go directly to rest. He shook him by the hand and quitted the cottage. Rose soon after made her appearance and conducted Alexo to his chamber. Placing the lamp on the hearth of the fireplace, he seated himself by the window, for being now convinced into what hands he had fallen, he suffered himself to sink beneath the weight of sorrow and the dreadful horrors of reflection. As the moon rose at intervals from her bed of clouds and shone upon the scene, he endeavoured to examine the situation of the cottage, that if necessity should require it, he might be able to make his escape without difficulty. But the fear of being seen by Gaspardo, whom he suspected was lurking about the habitation, made him cautious of opening the window, and the thick brushwood that grew on all sides of the cottage limited his researches to a narrow circuit. He felt an inclination to lie down upon the mattress and repose himself, but suspicion and distrust too powerfully opposed the desires of nature. His little volume of favourite poems again supplied him with amusement, and fixing upon the following sonnet, which he had often read in the gardens of the convent with exquisite delight, he did not seek to repose until the morn broke through the shades of retiring night, and tiptoe stood on misty mountain tops. Sonnet to the Evening Star. When coming twilight veils the neighbouring plain, and twinkling sheep bells in the distant fold sound cheerful to the slow-paced village swain, who journeys snow-besprent and sad with cold, beside the drowsy team along the vale. Then thou, pale herald of departing day, cheer'st the poor woodman as across the heath, heedless of sleet or the bleak wintry gale, he tracks with lonely step the beaten way, lightening with silent fear the bell of death. Listening with silent fear the bell of death, or watchdogs howl, till ruddy elves appear, greeting with shouts and smiles their toil-spent sire, who from the lawnward side is wont to bear the moss-grown faggot for their evening fire. Sorry about the reading there. It's very difficult to read this due to the typeface here. So, chapter 6. Although that feels like a jump, doesn't it? But it's telling me it's chapter 6. Again, we have a quote from Akenside. So, an epigraph from Akenside. Now, nature speaks her genuine language, and the words of men, big with the very motion of their souls, declare with what that accumulated force the impetuous nerve of passion urges on the native weight and energy of things. When Gaspardo quitted the cottage, he proceeded to join a gang of outlaws in their rendezvous among the secret recesses of a solitary ruin. It had been a monastery in the days of the primitive monks. Several entire archways remained, and were beautifully covered with ivy and blooming wallflowers. As he passed through one of these venerable monuments of antiquity, the glimmering of a light among the ruins at a little distance from the pathway he was pursuing struck him with surprise. Darkness surrounded him, and the owl only disturbed the silence of the solitude as she rested on the mouldering battlements of the neighbouring ruin. He walked with hasty steps from the spot towards the recess to join his companions, and before he had gained the private road that led to the cavern, he heard a voice repeat his name aloud several times. On turning to discover who it was, he perceived a man coming through the adjoining bushes with great precipitation. It was Jacques, the son of Don Alfonso. He carried a lighted torch in his hand, and as the flame beamed upon his countenance, Gaspardo discovered it the picture of terror and apprehension. He asked him in a low and tremulous tone if he had seen anything. "Nothing," said Gaspardo. "The glimmering of a light in a distant part of the ruin startled me a little time back, but I suppose it was you or someone of the band." "Did you not see the brilliant cross it carried upon its bosom?" said Jacques, agitated in the extreme. "The brilliant cross which it carried on its bosom? Why, the fellow is mad. I tell you I saw nothing but a light at a distance." "It is strange," exclaimed Jacques, "that I should have seen these things so distinctly, and you nothing. It followed me through several windings of the wood, and looked at me with compassionate sorrow. If a murder has been committed in this solitary place, I thank God I'm not the perpetrator. There has been foul play somewhere, Gaspardo." Jacques had scarce finished his speech when he started forward and caught Gaspardo by the arm. "Look," said he in a whisper, "yonder is a spectre. It is now stealing through the middle archway of the ruin. Let us follow it." "Hold," cried Gaspardo. "Not for the dominion of earth would I follow a ghost. I say, let us retire. We may repent our temerity, for these nightly wanderers of the grave are generally averse to the curiosity of mortals." Jacques, with great reluctance, consented to his proposal, and they hurried by the nearest way to the cavern where they expected to meet the band. When they entered the private passage that led to the subterraneous apartment, they heard the sound of voices mingled with frequent bursts of laughter. The band was assembled, and when they entered the recess, Grinaldo approached them with delay. They, in excuse for their conduct, related the whole of their adventure near the old archway, but met with contempt and ridicule from the band, some of whom were in a state of intoxication. The subject was dropped, and they by turns questioned Gaspardo respecting the lady in his possession and the quantity of silver and other valuables stolen from the Jew at Madrid. He faithfully related every circumstance attending the adventure, and begged to know if Alexo might be taken into the gang. Grinaldo addressed them. He said that as their leader, Don Alfonso, was not present, it would be inconsistent with their established rules to adopt any measure or consent to any proposal without his knowledge. He therefore proposed an adjournment to the next night at the same hour. This was generally consented to, and they separated, each for his respective habitation. Early in the morning, Gaspardo called Alexo from his bed, and equipping him in an old leathern jacket, put an axe into his hand and bade him accompany him. They went into a remote part of the forest and began felling wood for faggots. As they were busy at work, a man, seemingly in deep reflection, with a spear under his arm, passed by them. "That's Don Alfonso," said Gaspardo, "our captain. I must speak to him, but will return immediately." He followed Alfonso through the thicket, and continued with him for some time. At length they both approached Alexo, and Gaspardo introduced him as his friend to the captain. Alfonso gave him his hand with an air of such respectful politeness that it convinced Alexo he was not one of the same stamp with Gaspardo, and misfortune appeared upon his brow marked with the strongest characters. When Alfonso parted with them, he retired to his cottage. As night approached, he felt himself unusually restless and disturbed in his mind. He walked in the garden before the cottage, but a propensity to melancholy reflection obliged him to retire to rest. He fell into a light slumber, but about midnight he awoke in consequence of a loud clap of thunder that shook the cottage to its foundation. He started from his bed, and hastening to the window perceived the heavens sheeted with lightning. Ere the tempest ceased, he sunk again to sleep, but in his dreams the terrific images of death and murder harassed him until the cold drops of perspiration poured down his forehead upon his pillow, already wet with tears. On a sudden, he again started from his bed, and supporting himself by the curtain, exclaimed, "If thou art suffered by Providence to revisit the earth, say, bloody spectre, what is the crime thou comest to charge me with? What deed have I committed that the quiet of my repose should be thus disturbed? Speak to the purpose of thy visit." At this instant he was roused from a state of almost perfect insensibility by a loud rap at his chamber door. "Who is there?" he cried. "Your son," replied Jacques, "who has come to remind you of your engagement with the band." "I will be with you instantly," he answered. After a few minutes he became collected, for the vision that he supposed himself to be addressing he found nothing more than the impression of a horrid dream. But as he passed under the mouldering walls of the once sainted edifice to gain a private path that led to the cabin, his heart thrilled with an unaccountable dread. The dream still created in his mind a superstitious fear, and considered it as the warning of some dreadful event near at hand. The moaning of the wind among the trees that shaded the fragments of the tower, or the bat as it flitted in its way, caused him to start involuntarily with horror. On his entering the cabin, the band rose to receive him, but expressed their astonishment at his unusual appearance. His cloak thrown carelessly over his shoulder, his hair dishevelled, and without being armed he seemed like one distracted. Rinaldo approached him with concern, and inquired the cause of his singular appearance. He assumed a cheerful countenance, and assured them that he was perfectly well, but had overslept himself, and that the disorder of his clothes arose partly from forgetfulness, and partly from the precipitate manner in which he had left his bed. He begged the business of the night might not be interrupted, and seating himself at the head of the council, began to question Gaspardo concerning the adventure at Madrid. "It is unparalleled in the annals of finesse," said one. "The plan was executed with infinite credit to the connoisseur that projected it." "Ah," replied Moreau, a robber of the most abandoned and sanguinary principles. "It was excellently contrived and executed, but the lady is the subject that most demands our attention. She, in all probability, will discover the nature of our profession if we send her away. Our lives will be, no doubt, pay for such incautious conduct. If we retain her, she'll inevitably be a disagreeable burthen to us. It's a melancholy reflection that the crime of murder should be registered among the acts of imperious necessity, but so it is. And in this instance we must not depart from the sure method of preserving our lives and property." "Why not?" said Alfonso. "Imprison her. Is it like men to murder a woman in cold blood? Is it possible, Moreau, you can reconcile such a horrid act of barbarity to your conscience? Is nature so deficient in her duty as not to shudder at such unprincipled cruelty? I shall never voluntarily consent to the proposition." A warm debate took place, but Moreau continued firmly to support his plan upon principles of the vilest nature. The majority too were of his opinion, and in spite of Alfonso's threats and entreaties, the question was carried in the affirmative. Jacques was the person to whose lot fell the executive part of this barbarous decree. When affliction drives us to despair, it is to the silent walks of solitude that the mind turns with peculiar pleasure to indulge itself in melancholy sorrow. For the deep gloom of the grove at midnight and the stillness of the hour, interrupted only at intervals by the nightingale, call forth the energy of contemplation and inspire the unfortunate with a degree of pleasing reflection, not to be met with in the busy walks of life, crowded with the sons of licentiousness and bigotry. Alfonso retired alone from the cavern and wandered in the more solitary parts of the forest. "Thank God," said he, "that I had sufficient courage to oppose the villains in their design upon the life of this unfortunate stranger. I've done my duty as a man, although I've been unsuccessful in my endeavours to prevent them from murdering her. She may be married. I have a helpless family depending on her for protection. I am married, oh God, and have left exposed to the insults of an imperious world a wife and daughter. Coward-like, rather than meet my fate upon the scaffold. Oh, my Clorinda, my Cleanthe." Sorry, wrong voice. At this moment, a man approached him, muffled in his cloak. Alfonso, suspecting it was one of the robbers, fled from the spot and endeavoured to secrete himself, when the stranger threw his cloak on the ground and hastily followed him. Finding himself unable to elude the vigilance of his pursuer, he waited his arrival and discovered in the unknown the person of his son. "Oh, my father," said Jacques, "tonight the lady is to die, and I am the person commissioned by the gang to perpetrate the deed. Tell me, if the tie that binds me to this horde of ruffians is so sacred as to be esteemed before those of honour and humanity. God, these hands are yet unpolluted with the blood of human nature, and to steep them deliberately in that of innocence? To plunge a dagger in the bosom of a guileless stranger, an unfortunate victim of treachery, would doom me to eternal misery in the pit of hell. By the powers that rule the world, I cannot do it. I'd rather die by the swords of our confederates than live to think upon a crime that no penitence can expiate." "My son," replied Alfonso, "reflect upon the dreadful consequences of a refusal. You'll be instantly sacrificed to the fury of Moreau, that sanguinary ruffian. It is the first crime wilfully committed that dooms the perpetrator to an eternal punishment in the world to come. Perhaps it may be pardoned. The mercy of God is infinite, and the victim of dire necessity is not like a voluntary agent. If you are destroyed, I shall be left to the mercy of these fellows without one on whom I can depend for assistance if necessity should require it." They heard a horn sounded in a distant part of the forest, and fearing some of the party might surprise them, hastily left the spot and gained their cottage unobserved. When the fatal evening approached, it appeared to Jacques unusually dark and still. The wild shrieks of the deathbird were constantly heard near the cottage, and the wind, as it blew hollow amongst the trees, sounded to him mournful and prophetic. The time of midnight drew near. Tears prevented Alfonso from speaking, but he roused Jacques from a state of stupefaction and pointed to the dial, the hand of which was on the power of 12. "I go," he cried as he unsheathed a shining poniard. "I go to steep my hands in human blood, but necessity has no law. I hope to make my peace with God." Muffling himself in his cloak, he left the cottage and proceeded immediately for Gaspardo's hut. It was past 12 when he reached it, and he found Gaspardo waiting for his arrival at the garden gate. "Where is the lady?" said Jacques as he entered the hut. "Hush!" cried the villain. "She sleeps in the chamber directly above us, and has been in bed but a short time. Is Alexo in the cottage?" "Oh, no," replied Gaspardo. "He is safe. I watched him into the most secret part of the ruins. All is ready, and I have properly trimmed the lamp in her chamber with bad oil for the fainter light, you know. The better you'll be able to escape if she should awake." Jacques ascended the stairs and discovered the door of the chamber ajar. He cautiously entered the apartment and was proceeding to the bedside when a faint groan that echoed along the room arrested his attention. Immediately a cold dew spread all over him. He durst not advance to perpetrate the deed, and for some time strove in vain to conquer the unaccountable dread that seized him. After a little time had elapsed, he collected himself, and advancing to the bed to execute his bloody commission, drew back the curtains and gazed upon Clorinda, who was in the profound repose, with silent and agonizing sorrow. "Her next sleep," said he, as he raised his arm to plunge a dagger in her bosom, "will be death." She instantly sighed and repeated with tender emphasis, "Alfonso, oh, Alfonso." Struck with surprise and horror at this unexpected circumstance, he was precipitately quitting the room, when the glittering of a diamond cross that lay upon the table where the lamp was placed attracted his notice. He immediately recollected that his father had frequently inquired of him if he had ever seen one of the same kind in the possession of any of the banditti, and stepping gently to the table, he took it up and was on the point of examining examining it by the lamp when someone whispered his name at the door. Suspecting it to be Gaspardo, he secreted the cross in his bosom and opened the door with an intention to dismiss him by a significant frown. But the way was perfectly clear, and without loss of time he locked the door and put the key into his pocket. She must be roused from slumber before anyone can enter the chamber, he whispered to himself. A mere alarm rose with her shrieks if Gaspardo's villainy should prompt him to murder her before my return. The ruffian was waiting for him, wrapped in a long fur cloak at the bottom of the stairs. Have you executed your commission? Is the lady dead? He cried, eagerly catching hold of Jacques as he passed him. No, he replied. As I was about to murder her, I found I had, in my haste to be punctual to the time appointed for the purpose, forgot to arm myself with a dagger. She sleeps very sound, and I shall be gone but a few moments. Oh, that is bad, exclaimed the villain. Very bad indeed. But you need not return. Here, drawing a dagger from his belt, here's one that knows its duty. Take it and be quick about the matter. The night's very far advanced, and the morning will be upon us before we can set things to rights again. I dare not, said Jacques as he shook the ruffian by the hand. I dare not disobey the orders of Moreau, who gave me one of his own daggers and bade me bring it to him crimsoned with her blood. You know his temper. I do, cried Gaspardo. He's the father of everything that's inhuman and bad, passionate and bloodthirsty to a degree of barbarity. Go, return speedily, for I shall be very surly and displeased if the lady's not murdered tonight. Instantly, Jacques flew to his father's cottage and rapped loudly at the door. He waited in dreadful anxiety for admittance, but no one appeared. He tried to open it, but in vain. The time was precious, and such an unfortunate delay almost drove him to distraction. After a few moments' deliberation, he determined to search for him at the old sepulchre, his father's nightly haunt for private reflection and prayer. But ere he had closed the garden gate, Alfonso appeared armed with a naked sword and seized his son by the arm. Suspecting him to be one of the gang who had been to plunder his habitation, he demanded his business in an angry tone and threatened him with the death for his temerity. Pardon me, father, exclaimed Jacques, but I have accidentally discovered. He interrupted him. Is it Jacques? How? So soon returned, my son? Have you murdered the lady? No, circumstances of a very interesting nature prevented me. The cross that you have so often told me to respect as the hallowed tribute of affection, I found in the possession of this unfortunate lady. Great God, exclaimed Alfonso. It cannot be true. Where is it? Give it me that I may satisfy my suspicions. A lamp was instantly lighted at the glowing embers of a wood fire, and the moment of Alfonso's eyes were cast upon the cross, animation seemed for a time suspended. At length a flood of tears flowed down his cheeks, and supporting himself upon his sword, he lifted his eyes to heaven and exclaimed, Accept my thanks, O God, for thy merciful and benign protection. Turning to Jacques, you said you had not murdered her. I did not, but I promised Gaspardo that I would return and dispatch her before morning. Not for the sole possession of all earthly treasures. Return directly with this ring and wake her. At the first sight of it she may be alarmed, but conjure her to be silent and follow your directions. Wrap her in this cloak and bring her as a dead body from the villain's cottage to the old sepulchre amongst the ruins. I will there wait your return. Be bold and resolute in the execution of this trust, for the lady who you were commissioned to murder is your mother. They separated at the entrance of the wood, and Jacques returned with all possible haste to the cottage of Gaspardo, and found him as before waiting for him at the garden gate. So, he exclaimed as Jacques approached, you have at last found your way back again. If expedition is requisite in cases of necessity, you're a very pretty fellow to confide in. Damn me, you'll soon find that my associates are not such easy-tempered gentlemen, if you flatter yourself that cowardly tricks are accomplishments. He gave him no reply, but making his way upstairs, unlocked the chamber door, and stepping gently to the bedside, awoke Clorinda. She shrieked aloud on perceiving a man armed with a drawn dagger leaning upon her pillow. Hush, said he. For God's sake, your life depends upon silence, and your obeying my commands. Villain, she exclaimed. That naked poniard plainly evinces your business in my chamber at this late hour. Hesitate not to fulfill your trust. I will cheerfully forgive you, for I am tired of my existence. I am no murderer, he replied, laying hold of her hand. But your friend, rise, look at this ring. She immediately quitted the bed, having retired to rest in her clothes, and examined it at the lamp. A livid paleness diffused itself over her countenance as she pressed it to her lips, and rushing into the arms of Jacques, swooned upon his bosom. He immediately pierced his hand with the dagger, and staining the bedclothes and floor with blood, wrapped the lifeless Clorinda in his cloak, and quitted the apartment with her in his arms. Gaspardo met him upon the stairs. "Oh, joy, joy!" he cried when he saw Jacques bearing Clorinda in his arms. "Suppose I assist you in burying the body?" "Assist me to bury the body, indeed, when there's an hour's work upstairs for you. The bedclothes and floor are stained with blood, and Rose will evidently discover what we've been about if she finds such marks of cruelty in the chamber." "True," answered Gaspardo. "That is well thought of. Rose must not be in the secret. Her confounded ideas of humanity and religion would cause me to lead the life of a dog if she found us out." Looking through the cottage window, "Come, come," he cried. "There are many stars yet to be seen. The morning is not so near as expected. Farewell, my good fellow. Let her have a decent burial, and be sure you do not suffer your conscience to get the better of your courage." He opened the door and continued watching Jacques until he disappeared by striking suddenly into an intricate path that led into the bosom of the wood, when he returned to the chamber in order to free it from the suspicious marks of villainy it exhibited. Jacques hurried to the sepulchre and found his father at the entrance, anxiously awaiting his return. He flew to meet him, and clasping the insensible Clorinda in his arms, proceeded instantly by a private pathway to his cottage. When he had recovered from the natural effect of so unexpected an event, mutual sensations of joy and sorrow succeeded. But it is by conception only that the feelings of Alfonso and Clorinda can be known. The powers of language are inadequate to such a task. She fell upon his breast and exclaimed in a flood of tears, "Oh, my beloved husband! Since that fatal night which separated us, I have been harassed by a succession of unprecedented and cruel misfortunes. The hallowed bosom of the church, that sacred refuge for the unfortunate, contains your worst and barbarous enemy. Oh, my husband, your daughter, the beautiful and adored Clorinda, is murdered."
"Murdered?" cried Alfonso, as he started from his chair. "Murdered? Did you say murdered? Where was the hand of Bertram? Where was his boasted love for my Cleanthe?"
"Yes," replied Clorinda, "murdered, foully murdered, by Jerome, a friar of the order of St. Benedict. Bertram at the time was on a journey in Andalusia."
"Almighty God! I never expected to combat with this misfortune, in addition to the sorrows that thou hast loaded me with."
His speech faltered. He staggered to his chair and burst into a flood of tears. As soon as he had recovered himself, Clorinda related to him her unjust confinement in the prison of the Inquisition, the cause of her daughter's murder, and the appearance of the spectre. When she mentioned the bloody cross, Alfonso recollected that the spirit which he fancied had appeared to him in his chamber during the tempest held the same emblem of Catholic perfidy in its hand. From this circumstance he concluded that it must have been the apparition of his beloved Cleanthe. When Alfonso related to her his adventures since their parting and the mode of life he pursued, Clorinda was struck with the deepest concern and astonishment.
"It is an act of necessity," said Alfonso. "For as Jacques and myself were travelling through this forest, we were surprised by robbers, habited as herdsmen, and conducted to a castle hard by, where we remained in confinement for some days. At last the master offered us our lives if we would consent to join the gang and live in the forest with his associates. This proposal was not rejected, and we have only waited a favourable opportunity to effect our escape. A plan for that purpose is now in agitation."
The dawn of day was now seen to break through the branches of the tall trees that surrounded the cottage, and Alfonso, after procuring some refreshment for Clorinda, left Jacques in the cottage with his mother, and retired alone into the wood. As he was at work making faggots, he heard a man uttering the following soliloquy: "No reasoning shall convince me to the contrary. Day after day the same horrid acts are perpetuated with impunity. There is a God whom we are taught to adore as the spirit of universal benevolence and justice. But why the bolts of his almighty vengeance are not hurled against these villains, why the laws of morality and religion are to be grossly violated, and why an established system of debauchery and murder is to be erected by the ministers of his holy word, are questions that no philosophy, however subtle, can satisfy. Last night the unfortunate stranger was murdered, and the perpetrator of that horrid crime is a man. Great God, I burn with indignation when I find myself a being capable of committing premeditated acts of the blackest and most malignant dye, of ranking myself with the world of brutes by hunting down my fellow creatures for prey. If the mouldering corpse of that unfortunate victim be secreted in this forest, May the caves and lonely recesses ring with the piercing complaints of her wandering ghost. May it haunt the villain in his retirement and harrow up his mind to the highest pitch of distracting wretchedness. Struck with surprise at this singular speech, Alfonso made towards the spot where he heard the voice, and discovered Alexo prostrate on the ground and in tears. He spoke to him. The sorrower rose from the ground and was hastily retiring. "Why," said Alfonso, "will you fly with me? Will you fly me? Why desert the man who is your friend? Why quit the society of one who is destined to endure in exile with yourself the keenest pangs of sorrow and misfortune? The lady whom you so affectionately lament is alive." "Alive?" exclaimed Alexo as he rushed towards Alfonso. "Yes," he replied. "She is alive in a place of security. I possess but little knowledge of your character, but have entrusted you with a secret on which my life depends, confident you are worthy of my esteem from the sentiments you have just now uttered in this solitude. But I see Gaspardo at a distance. Meet me tonight at 12 near the old archway in the ruins, and you shall be further acquainted with me and my friends. Farewell." At the hour of midnight, Don Alfonso committed Clorinda to the care of his son, and wrapping himself in his cloak, went to the old archway, where he found Alexa waiting for him as appointed. The moon had risen, and shining with unclouded brilliancy upon the scene, her light enabled them to proceed with expedition to the ruin. "Here," said Alfonso as he entered the sepulchre, "here I retire alone, when I can escape from the company of our associates, to devote a few hours to reflection, and the memory of those days which I spent free from care and distress in the bosom of my beloved, though now unhappy family." He seated himself near a mutilated statue of the Virgin Mary, and began his history by discovering to Alexo his real situation with the robbers, and the cause that forced him from his home. He mentioned the appearance of the spirit, and lamented with the severest sorrows the loss of his unfortunate child. "Oh, my friend," replied Alexo, "the opinion you heard me delivering concerning religion flowed from the inmost recesses of my heart. I was initiated at an early age into the monastery of St. Dominic at Madrid, but discovering the friars of the order to possess principles of the most abandoned nature, I left the sanctuary in disgust, and was, in consequence, thrown into the horrid prison of the Inquisition. It was in my dungeon, Don Alfonso, that I accidentally found a manuscript written by your daughter, containing an account of her sufferings inflicted by Don Jerome, of the order of St. Dominic, her persecutor. The mouldering remains of an infant were also discovered in the same hole with the manuscript." "Oh, God!" exclaimed Alfonso. "The tale harrows me to distraction. You positively can confirm her death?" "I can," said Alexo. "The manuscript was finished by another person, who affirmed that Jerome, one night, after having urged the gratification of his brutal passion in vain, stabbed her to the heart. But his villainy will not escape punishment. I have deposited the manuscript and unburied bones of the babe with Friar Francis, a virtuous and holy monk of the same order, who has given me a solemn promise to exert his influence in bringing the guilty Jerome to the bar of justice." "God will reward you," replied Alfonso, "but I can no longer listen to a fact so replete with hellish cruelty and distress." He sank upon the ground in the agony of sorrow. At this moment a horn was sounded on the outside of the sepulchre. "Hark!" cried Alfonso, "that fatal note portends no good. Some of our party are abroad to-night, waiting, I suppose, to seize upon the unfortunate travellers that are bewildered in this dreadful forest." The sudden rushing of the wind down the staircase had nearly extinguished the light, and footsteps were soon after distinctly heard of some person descending into the sepulchre. Alexo unsheathed his sword and was proceeding with Alfonso to reconnoitre round the building, when Grinaldo entered the sanctuary. "You are in tears, Alfonso," said he as he entered the tomb. "You are so frail in nature as to seek out solitude to play the woman in?" "Alas, Grinaldo, you know not what piercing and undeserved sorrows have happened to my family since my unfortunate flight from Madrid. My daughter, the beautiful and beloved Cleanthe. Oh God, where was thy protecting arm?" "Oh, what can this mean?" exclaimed Grinaldo. "These frantic and distressing invocations, this distracted countenance, these tears, they must arise from some secret and severe misfortunes. Oh, suffer me to share them with you. Suffer me to mourn in friendship over the records of your misery." "I cannot repeat the tale," said Alfonso, drowned in tears. "I cannot think of it but with the fury of a madman. It is a crime too black for the catalogues of human villainies. It is a deed that would blast the character of a savage. If there is a hell, Rome cannot escape the punishment of the damned." Grinaldo then listened to a circumstantial account of the whole affair, But ere Alexo had finished his tale, he looked at him with surprise and, grasping his hand, exclaimed, "Do you say a monk of the order of St. Dominic?" "Yes, sir," replied Alexo. "The villain was also a moral lecturer and confessor to the convent of St. Catherine's." "St. Catherine's?" said Grinaldo. "Is it possible that Bessari, a woman who was so universally esteemed in Madrid for her piety, her benevolence, and rigid adherence to morality, could admit into the sanctuary of her convent so profligate a character?" "Oh, sir," replied Alexo, "I am afraid she's not worthy of the good opinion you entertain of her. I once rescued from destruction a nun who was privately conveyed through a subterraneous passage from the Priory of St. Catherine's to the chapel of St. Dominic's convent. I have in my possession a picture which I found in the church after her enemies had disappeared with her. In the height of her distress, she frequently passed it to her lips and gazed upon it with affectionate rapture." He presented the miniature to Grinaldo. The friars," he continued, "in a conversation that I overheard, called her Amantha." "Merciful heaven!" exclaimed Grinaldo, striking his forehead violently with his hand. "What a secret have you revealed! What distressing tortures has that name conveyed to my afflicted heart! This picture, I with horror confess to be mine. My suspicions are confirmed. Oh, Alfonso, Amantha is the daughter of your wretched and distracted friend. This picture, when last we separated, I gave her in the convent parlour. She kissed it 1,000 times and hurried it to her bosom as the most sacred repository for a treasure ever to be adored and beloved. Misfortunes drove me from Madrid. The loss of a beautiful and beloved wife compelled me to forsake the world. I travelled for the re-establishment of my health, impaired by sorrow, but being seized by robbers, my servants were murdered and myself conducted to this forest. I committed Amantha to the protection of the perfidious Bessari until my return. This is the reward of my liberality and confidence. Accursed wretches! What vice, what deliberate villainy is there that you do not practice under the cloak of religion? Oh, God, this load of life is insupportable. In me, Alfonso, you behold the father of the too much injured Bertram, him who with high-toned authority forbade his son the common right of participating in the affections of the unfortunate Cleanthe. Heaven has now sufficiently punished me. Oh, my children!" "Is this the father of Bertram?" said Alfonso as he took him by the hand. "Is it possible that I found Don Bertram de Leyva, my companion in distress?" A pause of some minutes ensued, when Alfonso exclaimed, Come, we must not think too much of our misfortunes, nor brood with distress over the past errors of our lives. Rather let us seek out the capital, and hunt this barbarous libertine from his den. Is it worthy of our sex to endure calamities patiently, then call aloud for justice and the scourge of vengeance? We must not live to countenance a crime which by the sacred ties of paternal affection we are bound to punish. These murderers of our children shall not triumph in their guilt. Tomorrow at midnight I propose leaving this haunt. Part of the gang will be upon an excursion, and we can with ease master the rest if their curiosity should prompt them to watch our conduct. Oh, my friend, let us not give ourselves up to despair. There is an invisible protection extended to the unfortunate, for the lady who was to have been so barbarously murdered last night by Jacques proved to be his mother. Yes, Don Bertram, she is the wife of your unhappy friend." "Great God!" he cried. "When will the hovering clouds of mystery disperse, or fortune leave us to repose in quietude? I consent to leave the gang tomorrow night. Alexo, will you accompany us?" "Oh, yes, resolutely will I undertake anything to escape from such a perilous existence." "Then," said Alfonso, "we will rescue the horses in our possession, and station them by the left fountain in the great pathway of the forest as the day closes with my son Jacques and Alexo. We can repair secretly about midnight to the place when all is quiet, and the thieves at the skirts of the wood. We must arm ourselves for fear of an attack." When they had fully settled the plan for their escape, and were about to separate for the night, a horn was again heard at a little distance from the ruin. They listened attentively for some time, but all was silent. At last they accidentally perceived a man skulking among the ruins. "That is one of the gang," said Alfonso. "The villain in all probability has overheard our conversation. You, Alexo, had better return with Grimaldo to his cottage in case of a surprise." Alexo readily acceded to the proposal, and they parted. When Alfonso entered his cottage, Clorinda was sitting in the chamber by a small fire, reading a book of prayer. He communicated to her and Jacques his intention of decamping in the night with his friends from the haunt of the robbers, and bade them be in readiness to accompany him. "You do not mean," said she with anxiety, "to enter Madrid but in disguise?" "I cannot live in peace," cried Alfonso, "whilst the murderer of my daughter exists. But we will talk of that on our journey. Let us now go to bed, for I have need of repose." About an hour after they had retired to rest, Alfonso was disturbed by the sound of footsteps on the stair, and soon after a gentle shaking of his chamber door. He seized his sword and rose from his bed to discover the cause of his alarm, when he met Gaspardo cautiously entering the room with a naked dagger in his hand. On perceiving Alfonso, he started as with surprise, and immediately extinguished the lamp that stood upon the table near the fireplace. The disappearance of the light was the appointed signal for assistance from without, and instantly another ruffian entered the chamber. The moon fortunately was at the full, and shone with great brilliancy through the lattice. Alfonso, by this circumstance, was enabled to defend himself against the united attacks of the ruffians. He shouted for assistance. At that instant, Gaspardo fired a pistol, but the shot passed by him, and pierced through the curtains of the bed. Jacques, who was sleeping in a room above, roused by the noise in his father's chamber, entered the apartment, and found his father gallantly engaged in a desperate combat with one of the ruffians. He instantly took part in the conflict, and shot him through the head. Gaspardo, on hearing Jacques upon the stairs, contrived to make his escape. During the scuffle, Donna Clorinda had fainted. As they were endeavouring to recover her, footsteps were again heard upon the stairs. They left the bedside and prepared to renew the combat, but Alexo entered in his shirt, covered with blood, and a naked sword in his hand. "The barbarous ruffians!" he cried, "are foiled in their attempt to murder us." "Where is Don Bertram?" said Alfonso. "Is he fallen?" "Oh, no," replied Alexo. "He sent me here to warn you of the danger that threatened us, but I see you have had your share in the fray." At this moment a voice without shouted, "Halloo! Halloo!" "There he is," cried Alfonso, and rushing downstairs, found him at the door, dragging along with him a wounded robber. "This is the only one alive out of 3, said Don Bertrand, "and I propose this fellow to make a confession of the horrid conspiracy against our lives." By this time the party had assembled below, and a fire lighted upon the hearth. Mutual congratulations now passed between them. Don Alfonso embraced the almost expiring Clorinda in a transport of affectionate joy. In vain did they urge the dying ruffian to confess. The natural brutality of his disposition, aided by the effect of his immoral habits, rendered him sullen and obstinate. But when the convulsions of death warned him of his dissolution, he confessed the whole plan, and gave circumstantial account of what course the robbers intended to pursue after they had accomplished their design. "Previous to this abandoned way of enriching ourselves," he cried with apparent contrition, "we were friars, belonging to the holy order of St. Dominic, but by too strictly observing and enforcing the laws by which the society was regulated, we incurred the displeasure of Father Jerome, an officer of the Inquisition, who drove us from the convent in ignominy, and upon the disgraceful charge of incontinence. To save his own reputation, he persuaded the inquisitors to issue orders to all convents in Spain not to admit us. Persecuted, and with beggary staring us in the face." His speech faltered, and in an instant he expired without a groan. In the morning, Don Alfonso and his companions buried the bodies of the thieves in an unfrequented part of the forest, and saddling the horses of the banditti, left their wild retreat for the capital. They journeyed through the byways of the forest until the shades of evening approached, when they entered upon a wide, uninhabited plain. The night proved tempestuous, but encouraged with the hope of discovering some herdsman's cottage upon the wild, they determined to pursue their route and abandon the idea of returning back to the forest for shelter. As they ascended a hill, one of the party discovered a light at some distance, and making for the spot, they found it proceeded from a taper burning in the chamber window of a solitary hut. Jacques called aloud for admittance, but no one answered or appeared. They plainly saw through a crevice in the door the blaze of a wood fire and an extinguished lamp upon a small table before it. After waiting some time and repeating their shouts with violent raps at the door, a woman opened the small window near the roof and inquired who they were and what they wanted. "We are benighted travellers," said Jacques, "requesting admittance." I dare not let you in," she replied. "My life would be forfeited if I did. There is a castle not far off if you pursue your journey in a straight line from the next monumental cross. Jacques urged his request with repeated promises of protection from violence, but to no purpose. She continued firm to her first answer and withdrew. As they were about to break open the door, a person at some distance repeated the name of Gaspardo. Jacques immediately suspected the signal and, muffling himself in his cloak, advanced to meet the stranger. On his approach, the man whispered, "Is it all over? Are the bodies buried?" "Yes," said Jacques, "but more of that when we get into the cottage. At the door are some fresh travellers waiting for admittance. Take time, and we may dispatch them also." "Bravo!" cried the man. "Bravo! Let us go into the stable. I've been upon watch for some time for you." He conducted Jacques through a private way into the hut and immediately opened the door to admit his friends. But on Alexo's unmuffling his face, the woman, whom they discovered to be Rose, the wife of Gaspardo, immediately exclaimed, "Lord of heaven, we are undone!" No idea what's going on, guys. "Why, how now?" cried the astonished herdsman. "What in the name of the devil have I been deceived? By the blood of the Virgin!" laying his hand on his dagger. "Hold," cried Jacques as he drew his sword from the scabbard. "We come to tell you that your companions are at rest in their graves. Their villainy was detected, and we have sacrificed them to our resentment." "Ah," said Rose, "I told them all how it would be. They still persisted in their scheme. Well, they've got their reward now for all their crimes, and I am free from a monster." At this, the herdsman assumed a more cheerful countenance and brought out the best of everything that his cupboard afforded, bidding the travellers make merry, and endeavoured with affected hospitality to drown all suspicion as to his real character. During the night, however, he several times quitted the cottage and returned apparently more and more dissatisfied, suspecting the tale of Jacques to be unfounded. He repeatedly whistled loud and shrill from the chamber window, and left a light burning in the casement that looked toward the forest. But as the morning dawned without the appearance of Gaspardo and his associates, he despaired of being revenged upon his guests, and behaved to them with great civility and attention. Soon after daybreak they left the herdsman's cottage, and taking a beaten route as directed by their host, pursued their journey until noon, when they arrived at an inn contiguous to a small village upon the highway, where they alighted for refreshment. On entering a small room appropriated for travellers of respectable appearance, they perceived a proclamation stuck over the chimney-piece. It related the recovery of the king from a violent and alarming fit of sickness, and that in consequence of so fortunate an event, it recalled all exiles of whatever denomination, pardoned the supposed conspirators who had fled from the vengeance of the state, and restored the confiscated property of the delinquents. It is impossible to express the joy of this agreeable intelligence diffused over every countenance, and they embraced each other in exultation, and after having procured a carriage for the better accommodation of Clorinda, pursued their journey to Madrid with utmost dispatch. Oh my God, that was a long chapter, wasn't it, guys? So, sorry about that. I got a bit lost there at the end. I was like, how on earth is Rose here? I still don't really understand why Rose was in a cottage like miles away from her cottage, and she apparently did know that everyone was a robber, and now she's living in a herdsman's hut. What on earth is going on? I don't know. Literally no clues what's going on there. It's not necessarily always the best plotted and most coherent, but certainly a lot has happened today. A lot of fun. A couple of great moments for me. I think my favorite is probably when Gaspardo's like, "Mate, I'm going to be well annoyed if you don't murder her tonight." um, a good bit of poetry there in the middle, breaking up the fear of death. And also, I think the fight where they're having this sort of epic sword fight, and Jack's just coming in and shoots somebody in the head, and you're like, oh, okay, cool, yeah, that's effective. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it with me. We'll read more tomorrow, probably not as long as today because this was epic. So anyway, night night, ghouls. I hope you enjoyed. Oh, I can't find the stop record button now. Let me just find it. Good.